Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most iconic structures, the Colosseum in Rome, to explore what it was actually like to attend the gladiatorial games that captivated the Roman world. This isn't about glorifying violence or dwelling on unnecessary details, but rather understanding the social, cultural and human dimensions of an experience that defined Roman entertainment for centuries. Before we begin this journey into ancient Rome, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these thoughtful explorations of history's most fascinating moments resonate with you. Feel free to share in the comments where in the world everyone is watching from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this community span across continents and time zones. Now, settle in comfortably. Perhaps imagine the warm Mediterranean sun and the distant roar of an ancient crowd, and let's explore together what it meant to be among the 50,000 spectators gathered in Rome's greatest arena. When modern people think about the Colosseum and gladiatorial games, they often imagine scenes from movies, dramatic music, choreographed combat, heroic gladiators facing impossible odds while crowds cheer. The reality, as with most historical experiences, was far more complex, more nuanced, and in many ways more interesting than Hollywood depictions suggest. The games were deeply embedded in Roman culture, serving functions that went far beyond simple entertainment. Understanding the spectator experience requires examining multiple dimensions: the physical reality of attending a day-long event in a massive stone amphitheatre, the social dynamics that shaped who sat where and how they behaved, the psychological impact of witnessing events that modern sensibilities find troubling, the political purposes these spectacles served, and the ways ordinary Romans understood and interpreted what they witnessed. The Colosseum itself, properly called the Flavian Amphitheatre, named for the dynasty that built it, was an architectural marvel that still impresses nearly 2,000 years after its construction. Begun under Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE and completed under his son Titus in 80 CE, the structure represented Roman engineering at its finest. It could hold approximately 50,000 to 65,000 spectators, depending on how packed the seating arrangements were, making it comparable to a modern large stadium. The experience of attending games at the Colosseum began long before spectators entered the arena itself. For Romans living in the city, the days leading up to major games were filled with anticipation. Announcements would be posted around the city, painted advertisements describing the upcoming events, the number of gladiators who would appear, special attractions like exotic animals, and the sponsor providing the entertainment. These announcements generated conversation, debate, and excitement throughout the city. Understanding what drew Romans to these spectacles requires setting aside modern moral frameworks temporarily, and entering a worldview where such displays were normalized, celebrated, and deeply meaningful. For Romans, the games represented a complex intersection of religion, politics, social status, community identity, and collective experience that served functions difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate. The experience of attending games began with the journey to the Colosseum itself, a process that varied dramatically depending on one's social status and where in Rome a person lived. Understanding this journey reveals much about Roman society and the logistics of moving tens of thousands of people to a single location. For the wealthy elite living on the Palatine Hill, the most prestigious neighbourhood where emperors and aristocrats maintained their residences, the journey was relatively short and comfortable. These privileged spectators might travel in covered litters carried by slaves, protecting them from sun, rain, and the dust of Rome's streets. The litters would navigate through crowded thoroughfares, with slaves calling out to clear the way, arriving at the Colosseum's special entrances reserved for the upper classes. For the vast majority of spectators, however, the journey was on foot through Rome's crowded, noisy streets. The city's population in the imperial period reached approximately 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban centres in the ancient world. The streets were narrow, crowded with vendors, animals, vehicles, and humanity in all its chaotic variety. Walking to the Colosseum meant navigating through this urban density, joining streams of other spectators all heading in the same direction. The Colosseum's location was strategic and symbolic. Built in the valley between Rome's hills, on land that had been part of Emperor Nero's lavish private palace complex, the amphitheatre represented the restoration of space to the Roman people. Where Nero had built for his own pleasure, the Flavian emperors built for public enjoyment, a calculated political message that wasn't lost on the populace. As spectators approached the structure, its sheer scale became apparent. The Colosseum rises to approximately 159 feet at its highest point, its exterior featuring 4 stories of arches and columns in different architectural orders. The building's footprint covers about 6 acres. For ancient viewers accustomed to impressive architecture, Rome was filled with magnificent temples, basilicas and public buildings. The Colosseum still inspired awe through its size and grandeur. The exterior was faced with travertine limestone, giving it a gleaming appearance that would have been particularly striking under Mediterranean sun. The facade was decorated with statues placed in the arches of the upper stories, adding to the visual splendour. The overall effect was designed to impress, to demonstrate Roman power and sophistication, and to create anticipation for what waited inside. The structure had 80 numbered entrances at ground level, called vomitoria, a term referring to how they spewed forth crowds, not related to modern associations. Each entrance was marked with Roman numerals, and spectators would have received tokens or tickets indicating which entrance to use. This systematic approach to crowd management was sophisticated by ancient standards, allowing the massive structure to fill and empty with relative efficiency. The numbering system meant that spectators knew exactly where to enter, reducing confusion and bottlenecks. Archaeological evidence includes fragments of these entrance tokens, small pieces of pottery or bone with numbers and seat sections marked on them. These tokens would be checked by attendants at the entrances, verifying that spectators were heading to their appropriate sections. The privileged classes entered through special gates that led directly to the best seating areas. The imperial family and highest officials had their own private entrance, leading to the most prestigious boxes. This segregation by entrance reinforced social hierarchies from the moment of arrival. Even the act of entering the building reflected one's place in Roman society. For common citizens, the process of entering involved crowds, pushing, and the general chaos of thousands of people trying to access a limited number of entrances simultaneously. Ancient sources occasionally mention injuries occurring in the crush of crowds at popular events, suggesting that crowd control wasn't always perfectly managed despite the architectural sophistication of the entrance system. Once inside the entrance corridors, spectators encountered the Colosseum's remarkable internal architecture. The structure contained corridors, staircases, and passages that allowed people to reach different seating levels. The design was ingenious. Spectators could move from ground level to upper seating areas through a series of ramps and stairs without interfering with other traffic flows. This internal circulation system demonstrated advanced understanding of crowd movement and building design. The corridors were lit by torches and oil lamps, as natural light didn't penetrate deeply into the structure's interior. The atmosphere in these passages would have been close, perhaps slightly smoky from the lamps, echoing with the sound of thousands of footsteps and conversations. For spectators making their way to seats, this transitional space built anticipation. The arena itself remained unseen until they emerged into their seating sections. The climb to upper levels was tiring, particularly for those seated in the higher sections. The staircases were steep by modern standards, and ascending several stories of ancient stone steps while surrounded by crowds required physical effort. By the time spectators reached their seats, particularly those in the upper tiers, they would be breathing hard and ready to sit down. The journey to the Colosseum and through its entrances thus served as a prologue to the main event, a process that already began organising spectators by social rank, building anticipation through architectural impressiveness, and creating the shared experience of attending a major public spectacle. By the time Romans reached their seats, they had already participated in something larger than their individual presence. They were part of a massive collective gathering that reinforced community identity and social structure. Once inside the Colosseum, the seating arrangements revealed Roman social hierarchy with crystalline clarity. Where a spectator sat wasn't a matter of personal choice or ticket purchasing power. It was determined by social rank, legal status, gender, and occupation. Understanding this social geography is essential to comprehending what attending the games meant to Romans. The seating was arranged in horizontal sections called meniana, each designated for specific social classes. This wasn't subtle or hidden. The divisions were clear. reinforced by physical barriers and attended by officials who ensured people sat in their appropriate sections. The entire structure served as a three-dimensional representation of Roman society, with the most powerful at the bottom and the lowest classes at the top. The podium was the lowest level of seating, consisting of broad marble terraces just above the arena floor. This prime seating was reserved for the absolute elite, the emperor and his family in the imperial box, senators in their designated section, and vestal virgins, the priestesses who maintained Rome's sacred flame, in their own special seats. Also seated in the podium were certain high-ranking magistrates and distinguished foreign dignitaries. The imperial box, located at the arena's north end, was the focal point of the entire structure. Magnificently decorated, offering perfect views of the arena floor, and positioned to make the emperor visible to all spectators, this box represented the centre of Roman power. When the emperor attended games, which was frequent, as imperial presence was expected, the attention of 50,000 people would periodically turn toward this box, acknowledging the source of the entertainment and the embodiment of Roman authority. Senators wore togas with purple stripes, making them visually distinctive even from a distance. Their section of the podium afforded them excellent views and prestigious position, reinforcing their status as Rome's governing elite. The physical proximity to the arena floor meant these spectators saw events with clarity and immediacy that upper-level viewers couldn't match. They could see facial expressions, hear sounds of combat clearly, and witness details that became less distinct from higher elevations. The Vestal Virgins occupied their own section in the podium, reflecting their unique status in Roman society. These priestesses were simultaneously women, who were generally restricted to less prestigious seating, and sacred religious officials deserving of the highest honours. Their presence at the games added religious significance to the proceedings, and reinforced the connection between public spectacles and Roman religious life. The second tier of seating, the Manianium Primum, was reserved for equites, the equestrian class, wealthy Romans below senatorial rank but still quite prosperous. These were successful merchants, military officers, and wealthy landowners who formed an important middle layer of Roman elite society. Their seating was still quite good, providing clear views of events while marking them as distinctly separated from both the highest elite below and the common citizens above. The Manianum Secundum was divided into two sections. The lower part, Manianum Secundum Imum, was designated for ordinary Roman citizens. This was where the bulk of freeborn Romans would sit: shopkeepers, artisans, small merchants, the broad middle and lower middle classes that formed the majority of Rome's citizen population. The views from this section were more distant than from lower levels, requiring spectators to see events from greater heights, but still adequate for following the action. The upper part of the Manianum Secundum, called Manianum Secundum Summum, was further divided by gender and status. Women, regardless of their social class, except for the privileged Vestal Virgins, were required to sit in the upper sections of the Colosseum. This gender segregation was enforced consistently, reflecting Roman beliefs about proper public behaviour and women's place in society. Even wealthy women from aristocratic families had to sit in these upper sections, though they might have special areas within that upper zone that distinguished them from poor women. The reasoning behind this gender segregation mixed practical concerns with moral judgments. Roman authorities worried about inappropriate interactions between men and women at crowded public events. They also viewed women as more susceptible to the exciting, potentially corrupting atmosphere of the games, believing that segregation protected female virtue. The policy reinforced broader Roman ideas about gender differences and proper social organisation. The very top of the Colosseum, the Manianum Secundum in Lignaeus, so called because this section had wooden seating rather than marble or stone, was designated for the lowest social classes: poor citizens, foreigners, and slaves who were permitted to attend. The designation in Lignaeus literally means in wood, indicating the less substantial seating that marked its occupants' low status. From these higher seats, the view of the arena floor was distant and sharply angled. Details that were clearly visible from the podium became difficult to distinguish from such heights. The experience of watching games from these seats was fundamentally different from watching from lower levels. Spectators could follow general action, but couldn't see facial expressions, hear conversations, or witness the finer details that made events more immediate and impactful for those closer to the action. The architectural design included awnings called velaria that could be extended across the seating areas to provide shade. Operating these massive fabric awnings required teams of sailors from the Roman navy, specially assigned to this duty. The velaria didn't cover the entire seating area uniformly. Privileged sections received better shade coverage, adding another layer of differentiation to the seating hierarchy. Enforcement of seating regulations was taken seriously. Attendants monitored sections, and those attempting to sit in areas above their status would be removed and redirected to appropriate sections. Historical sources mention this enforcement, indicating it was necessary. People did try to access better seats, and authorities had to maintain the social order that the seating arrangements represented. The Emperor Augustus had codified many of these seating regulations, formalising what had previously been less rigid customs. His motivations were partly practical. Organising such huge crowds required clear systems, but also ideological. The games served as opportunities to display and reinforce Roman social hierarchy. When tens of thousands gathered, the visible arrangement of bodies in space communicated who mattered, who had power, and what relationships defined Roman society. Special groups received their own designated areas within appropriate social levels. Military veterans, for instance, had special sections that honoured their service. Married men sat separately from unmarried men in some sections. Boys who hadn't yet reached manhood sat with their tutors in designated areas. The level of detail in these arrangements was extraordinary, reflecting Roman concern with proper organisation and social categorisation. The seating arrangements had acoustic implications as well. The design of the amphitheatre naturally amplified sounds from the arena floor, but this amplification worked better for some sections than others. Lower seats heard sounds more directly and clearly. Upper levels caught sound that had already travelled, changed by distance and reflection off stone surfaces. This meant that the auditory experience varied by location as significantly as the visual experience. This social geography created a spectating experience that was simultaneously collective and divided. All spectators shared the basic experience of attending games and witnessing the same events, creating a sense of common Roman identity and shared cultural experience. Yet the experience varied dramatically by social position, with different physical comfort levels, different quality views, different acoustic experiences, and different social meaning attached to being present in different sections. The rigid enforcement of these divisions communicated clear messages. Social hierarchy wasn't just abstract ideology, it was physically instantiated in the architecture and seating arrangements of Rome's greatest public building. Every attendee, from emperor to slave, understood their place literally and figuratively. The Colosseum was entertainment venue, but it was also a massive three-dimensional diagram of Roman social order, teaching and reinforcing class distinctions through the very act of attending games. Once seated, spectators found themselves in an environment that assaulted the senses in ways both exhilarating and overwhelming. Understanding the sensory dimensions of attending games reveals aspects of the experience that are easy to overlook when focusing only on what happened in the arena itself. The visual experience began with the structure itself. The arena floor, covered with sand, the Latin word arena literally means sand, stretched approximately 287 feet long and 180 feet wide. This large open space, surrounded by walls about 15 feet high, created a stage where all action would be clearly visible to the assembled crowd. The sand served practical purposes. It provided traction for fighters and absorbed fluids that would otherwise create slippery, hazardous surfaces. The walls surrounding the arena were smooth and high enough to protect spectators from animals or fighters accidentally entering the crowd. The barrier was painted and decorated, though specific details of this decoration aren't fully preserved in the archaeological record. Above this wall rose the seating sections, tier upon tier, creating an imposing amphitheatre that enclosed and focused attention on the arena floor. Looking around, spectators saw thousands upon thousands of other people. The crowd itself became a spectacle, a sea of humanity filling the vast space, faces receding into distance in all directions. The Roman poet Martial, who wrote extensively about the amphitheatre, described the games as bringing together people from across the known world, creating a microcosm of the empire where people from diverse backgrounds gathered in shared experience. The crowd's clothing created visual variety. Senators in their purple-striped togas, equestrians in their white tunics with narrow purple bands, common citizens in simpler garments of various colours, soldiers in military attire, and the diversity of styles worn by foreign visitors all contributed to a kaleidoscope of visual interest beyond the arena floor itself. The sound environment was intense and varied. Before events began, 50,000 people talking created a roar of conversation that echoed off stone surfaces, amplified by the amphitheatre's acoustic properties. Individual conversations disappeared into this collective noise, creating an atmospheric hum that was simultaneously energizing and overwhelming. When events began, the crowd's noise changed character. Cheers, shouts, gasps, and reactions to arena action created waves of sound that rose and fell with the rhythms of what spectators witnessed. The collective voice of thousands reacting simultaneously to dramatic moments produced sound at volumes that modern people, accustomed to amplified music and public address systems, might still find striking. Musical instruments accompanied many aspects of the games. Horns, trumpets, and water organs, hydraulis, provided musical punctuation and accompaniment to various events. The water organ, in particular, was a Roman innovation that produced sound by forcing air through pipes using water pressure, creating an instrument capable of considerable volume and tonal range. These instruments announced different phases of the programme, built dramatic tension, and celebrated particularly exciting moments. The smells of the Colosseum were complex and not always pleasant. With 50,000 people gathered in one structure, human body odour was inevitable, particularly during warm weather. Romans didn't have modern deodorants or antiperspirants, and bathing practices, while more regular than in some later historical periods, didn't eliminate the reality of tens of thousands of warm human bodies in close proximity. The vendors selling food and drink added their own aromatic contributions. The smell of grilled meats, baked goods, roasted nuts, and various other foods mixed with the crowd smells, creating a distinctive atmosphere. Wine and other beverages spilled and consumed contributed to the olfactory environment. The arena itself generated smells, particularly when animals were involved. Large predators like lions, bears, and tigers produced strong odours even in the best of circumstances. Dozens of such animals, stressed and confined, created intense animal smells that would have been noticeable throughout much of the amphitheatre. The blood and other fluids that accumulated in the sand, despite regular raking and replacement, added to the sensory intensity, particularly for those seated in lower sections. Incense and perfumes were used deliberately to mask unpleasant odours. Before and during events, attendants would spray perfumed water into the crowd, circulate with censers burning aromatic substances, and release fragrant oils. These pleasant scents mixed with the less pleasant realities, creating complex olfactory experiences that varied throughout the day and across different sections of the seating. Temperature and weather were significant factors in spectator comfort. Rome's Mediterranean climate meant that summer events could be swelteringly hot, with stone and sand radiating stored heat, while tens of thousands of bodies generated additional warmth. The Valeria provided some shade, but they also trapped heat beneath them, creating greenhouse effects in covered sections. Spectators in full sun during summer games faced genuine risk of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Winter events, by contrast, could be uncomfortably cold. Stone seating absorbed cold, and sitting on cold stone for hours was unpleasant. Spectators would bring cushions or folded cloth to sit on, both for comfort and insulation. Warm clothing became essential for winter attendance, though the press of bodies provided some warmth through collective body heat. Rain created its own challenges. While the Valeria could provide some protection, they didn't cover the entire seating area, and driving rain could still reach many spectators. Stone seating became slippery when wet, and the arena floor could become muddy, affecting the events taking place. Major storms might lead to postponements or early endings to programmes, though Romans generally showed high tolerance for moderate weather discomfort. The tactile experience varied by seating location. Those in the marble-seated sections of the podium had smooth, relatively comfortable, by ancient standards, seating surfaces. Higher sections had stone or wooden seats that were harder and less finished. The lack of modern stadium seating amenities, no backs on seats, no armrests, narrow spacing between rows, meant that physical comfort required constant adjustment and tolerance for close contact with neighbouring spectators. Hours of sitting on hard stone created physical discomfort that all spectators shared, regardless of social status. Backs ached, legs went numb, and maintaining any single position became uncomfortable. Spectators would shift constantly, stand periodically to stretch, and move about when possible to relieve the strain of prolonged sitting. Thirst and hunger were managed through vendors who circulated through the crowd selling food and drink. The ability to purchase refreshments varied by wealth. Those who could afford to buy throughout the day ate and drank comfortably, while poor spectators might bring their own modest food or simply endure thirst and hunger as additional discomforts accompanying their attendance. The overall sensory experience was thus intense, varied, and often overwhelming. Modern entertainment tends toward controlled environments where temperature is regulated, seating is comfortable, and sensory inputs are carefully managed. The Colosseum offered no such refinements. It was raw, unfiltered sensory intensity that formed part of the event's character and appeal. A day at the Games followed a structured program that lasted from morning until late afternoon or evening, consisting of several distinct types of events that appealed to different tastes and served different purposes. Understanding this structure reveals how Romans organised and understood the entertainment they consumed. The morning typically began with the venations, animal hunts and displays. These events showcased exotic animals from across the Roman Empire and beyond. Lions from North Africa, bears from Germania, elephants from Africa and India, leopards, tigers, crocodiles, rhinoceroses, ostriches and countless other species. For Romans who would never travel beyond Italy, these displays offered opportunities to see creatures they knew only from descriptions or artistic representations. The Venetians served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. They demonstrated Roman power and reach. The ability to capture and transport such animals from remote territories demonstrated the empire's vast extent and organisational capabilities. They educated spectators about the empire's diversity and resources, and they provided spectacle that awed audiences through the sheer exotic quality of what they witnessed. The format of morning events varied. Some were straightforward hunts where trained hunters called venatores would pursue and dispatch animals in the arena. These hunters were skilled professionals, often specialising in particular animals, and their displays combined danger, skill, and theatricality. A successful venator could become a celebrity, known for particular prowess or signature techniques. Other morning events featured animal displays without hunting, showing creatures trained to perform behaviours, or simply allowing audiences to observe exotic animals. Elephants might be shown demonstrating their intelligence and trainability. Exotic birds would be displayed. Unusual creatures like giraffes or hippopotami would be presented for their sheer novelty value. Still other formats pitted animals against each other in staged combats. Bears versus bulls, dogs versus wolves, or other combinations designed to create dramatic conflict. These animal combats reflected Roman fascination with natural power and predatory behaviour, allowing observation of animal capabilities in contexts removed from natural settings. The numbers of animals involved in major games could be staggering. The inaugural games at the Colosseum in 80 CE reportedly featured 9,000 animals over 100 days of events, an average of 90 animals per day, though numbers varied significantly by event type and imperial generosity. These massive numbers ensured that morning programmes remained varied and engaging despite their length. The sheer logistics of managing such animals was extraordinary. Beneath the Colosseum's arena floor lay the Hippodrome, a complex network of underground passages, rooms, and mechanical devices. Animals were housed in cages in this underground facility, organised and ready for their arena appearances. Elaborate elevator systems powered by human labour could raise caged animals from the Hippodrome directly into the arena through trapdoors, creating dramatic entrances that surprised both animals and spectators. The experience of watching Venetians from the stands mixed fascination with exotic creatures, appreciation for the hunter's skills, and excitement at danger and unpredictability. The death of animals, while part of many morning events, wasn't necessarily the primary focus. Romans valued the display of variety, the demonstration of control over nature, and the exhibition of skill as much or more than simple ending of animal life. Midday brought a shift in programming to events that many modern people find most disturbing: the execution of condemned criminals. These executions took various forms, sometimes straightforward, but often elaborately staged as mythological reenactments or dramatic spectacles. Condemned individuals might be exposed to animals, put to the sword by guards, or executed through various methods that served both practical purposes of capital punishment and entertainment functions. The noontime execution served multiple purposes in Roman thinking. They provided public demonstration that law and order were maintained, and that crimes received certain punishment. They reinforced social boundaries by showing what happened to those who violated Roman norms. They filled the midday hours between morning and afternoon programs, and they provided spectacle, though of a different character than other events. Modern understanding of these executions is complicated by fragmentary historical sources and the challenge of comprehending a society with fundamentally different attitudes toward public suffering and death than contemporary cultures hold. What seems obviously wrong to modern sensibilities was normalized and justified in Roman culture through various rationales: punishment of genuine criminals, religious expiation, public demonstration of justice, and simple entertainment. Many Romans didn't stay for the noontime executions, using this time as an extended intermission to eat, socialize, conduct business, or simply take breaks from the intense sensory environment of the amphitheatre. Historical sources suggest that the most sophisticated and refined Romans often absented themselves during this portion of the programme, viewing it as vulgar or beneath their dignity, even while accepting the broader institution of the games. The afternoon brought the main event that most spectators had come to see: the munera, the gladiatorial combats. These were the most anticipated and celebrated portions of the day's programme, featuring trained fighters engaging in contests that combined athletic skill, martial prowess, and dramatic presentation. The gladiators entered the arena in a formal procession called the pompa, parading before the crowd in their armour and equipment, displaying the variety of fighting styles and types that would be featured. This procession built anticipation, allowed spectators to see the fighters they'd be watching, and created ceremonial dignity that elevated the combats above simple brawling. The variety of gladiator types, the heavily armed Mamilo, the net and trident-wielding Retiarius, the Thraex with his curved sword, the Provocator, the Secutor, and others, created diverse matchups that kept the afternoon programme interesting. Different combinations of fighter types created different tactical situations, different visual presentations, and different dramatic possibilities. Individual combats would be announced, with fighters introduced to the crowd. Any particular celebrities or notable fighters would receive special recognition, building excitement for their appearances. The combats themselves involved real skill and genuine danger, though the outcome wasn't necessarily predetermined or certain. Matches could end in various ways: one fighter clearly defeated, both fighters performing so well that both received honour, or occasionally a fighter receiving a mortal wound. Between combats, there were brief intermissions for arena maintenance, raking the sand, removing debris, preparing for the next bout. Musical interludes, announcements, and other transitional activities kept the audience engaged during these necessary breaks. The afternoon programme might also include other forms of entertainment: athletic displays, acrobatic performances, or demonstrations of various skills. These interludes provided variety and prevented the monotony that might come from too many similar combats in succession. The day's entertainment thus followed a carefully structured arc: morning exoticism and hunting, midday severity and justice, afternoon skill and valour. This structure reflected Roman thinking about the purposes and meanings of the games, creating a comprehensive programme that addressed multiple interests and served multiple functions. For spectators, the long day created an experience that was physically exhausting but collectively engaging. By the time events concluded in late afternoon or early evening, attendees had spent hours sitting, watching, reacting, and sharing experiences with thousands of others. The fatigue was part of the experience, contributing to the sense that attending the games was a major event requiring commitment and endurance. The Colosseum functioned as more than just an entertainment venue. It was a crucial social space where Romans interacted, conducted business, reinforced relationships, and participated in collective rituals that defined Roman identity. Understanding these social dimensions reveals why attending games mattered beyond the simple viewing of spectacles. For many Romans, attending the games was an opportunity to see and be seen. Social visibility mattered in Roman culture, where reputation, honour and social networks determined opportunities and status. Being present at major games demonstrated that one was part of the community, engaged in civic life, and maintaining the social connections that mattered in Roman society. The seating arrangements facilitated social interactions within status groups. Senators sat among other senators, creating opportunities for political discussion, negotiation, and relationship building. The games provided informal settings where political business could be conducted, alliances formed, and conflicts managed. Historical sources mention deals being struck, marriages arranged, and political manoeuvres executed during games, using the gathered crowds and festive atmosphere as backdrops for important business. For common citizens, the games offered rare opportunities to mingle with others of similar status from across the city. Rome's urban geography meant that neighbours in one district might rarely encounter people from other neighbourhoods in daily life. The games brought together Romans from throughout the city, creating moments of collective experience and shared identity that transcended neighbourhood particularism. The presence of the emperor was a major draw. When emperors attended games, which was common as imperial patronage and presence were expected, they were visible to all spectators, creating direct connections between ruler and ruled. The emperor might interact with the crowd through gestures, decisions about gladiator fates, or generosity in extending programs. These interactions reinforced the emperor's accessibility and connection to the people, maintaining a relationship crucial to imperial power. Emperors used game attendance strategically. A generous emperor who provided spectacular games earned popular support and affection. An emperor who appeared stingy or disengaged risked losing popular favour. The political calculations involved were sophisticated. Emperors had to balance expense against effect, manage crowd reactions, and use game attendance to demonstrate desired qualities of leadership, generosity, and strength. The crowd could also communicate with emperors through their collective voice. While direct criticism of emperors was dangerous, the assembled masses could express approval or disapproval through cheers, jeers, or pointed chants. Emperors monitored these reactions carefully, understanding that the crowd's mood reflected broader public sentiment. Some emperors were skilled at reading and responding to crowd dynamics, while others struggled with or resented this form of popular input. Social tensions occasionally erupted in the Colosseum. The famous riot at Pompeii in 59 CE, not at the Colosseum but at a local amphitheatre, demonstrated how games could become venues for expressing conflicts between cities, social classes, or factions. While major violence was relatively rare, the potential was always present when tens of thousands gathered, particularly when alcohol was consumed and emotions ran high. The games also served as venues for displaying wealth and status through other means beyond seating location. Wealthy patrons might sponsor games, their names prominently associated with the entertainment provided. These sponsors gained prestige, popularity, and political capital through their generosity. The cost of sponsoring major games could be enormous, but the political and social returns often justified the expense. For sponsors, the social dynamics included expectations of reciprocity. Providing games created obligations among those who benefited. Voters might support a sponsor's political ambitions. Clients might offer their services, and social networks would acknowledge the debt through future favours and support. The economic transaction of sponsor-providing entertainment created webs of social obligation that extended far beyond the immediate event. The food and drink consumed during games had social dimensions as well. Sharing food, buying rounds of wine for neighbours, or distributing delicacies demonstrated generosity and created social bonds. Some spectators would bring elaborate picnics, sharing with friends and building relationships through food. Others would purchase from vendors, and the act of buying for others or being treated created small social exchanges that accumulated into meaningful relationships. Gambling was common at the games. Romans bet on outcomes, which gladiator would win, how fights would end, how many animals would be dispatched in hunts. This gambling created additional investment in outcomes, intensifying engagement with events. It also created social dynamics as winners celebrated, losers commiserated, and friendly arguments erupted about techniques, skills, and probabilities. The discussions that occurred during games covered all topics of Roman life. Between combats, during less engaging moments of morning programs, or during intermissions, spectators would talk about politics, business, family matters, gossip, philosophy, anything that interested them. The games provided venues for extended social interaction that complemented the spectacle itself. For young people, attendance at games was educational in ways beyond witnessing events in the arena. They learned proper public behaviour, how to navigate social situations, how to interact with people of different statuses, and how to participate in collective Roman culture. Parents would bring children to teach them about Roman values, social structures, and cultural norms that the games exemplified. The collective experience of attendance created shared references and common ground for future conversations. Romans who attended games could discuss particular combats, remarkable moments, controversial decisions, or other events they witnessed together. These shared experiences bound communities together through common memory and references. The social functions of games attendance were thus multifaceted and crucial to understanding why Romans invested so much in these spectacles. The entertainment was real, but it was embedded in social context that gave attendance meaning beyond simple viewing of combat or animal displays. The Colosseum was theatre, political arena, social club, religious venue, and community gathering space all rolled into one massive stone structure. Understanding what it felt like psychologically to be a spectator at gladiatorial games requires careful consideration of Roman mental frameworks, cultural conditioning, and the complex human reactions to witnessing events that combined skill, danger, suffering, and spectacle. For Romans, the psychological framing of what they watched was fundamentally different from how modern people might interpret similar events. Romans understood gladiators as skilled professionals engaging in honourable contests that tested courage, skill, and character. The combat was contextualised within frameworks of virtue, honour, and proper masculine behaviour, rather than simply as violence for its own sake. The concept of virtues, Roman virtue, centred on courage, endurance, and proper conduct in the face of danger. Gladiatorial combat was understood as displaying virtues, showing how men should behave when facing mortality. This cultural framing meant that spectators watched not random violence, but demonstrations of valued qualities, performances that reinforced cultural ideals about proper behaviour and character. The psychological distance between spectators and participants was reinforced by social differences. Most gladiators were slaves, war captives, criminals, or social outsiders who occupied a status vastly different from free Roman citizens watching from the stands. This status difference created psychological separation. Spectators weren't watching people like them, but rather individuals from a different social category, whose experiences and fates didn't directly implicate viewer identity. However, this distance wasn't absolute. Historical sources reveal that Romans could and did feel various emotions about gladiators: admiration for skill, respect for courage, sympathy for those facing doom, and even attraction to successful fighters who became celebrities. The psychological experience was more complex than simple detachment or callousness might suggest. The excitement Romans felt had multiple sources beyond simple bloodlust. The athletic skill displayed in gladiatorial combat was genuine and impressive. The tactical thinking required to succeed in various matchup types created intellectual interest. The uncertainty of outcomes created suspense. The ceremony and presentation added theatrical dimensions that engaged emotions and aesthetic sensibilities. The collective nature of spectatorship created psychological dynamics that differ from individual experiences. In crowds, emotional reactions are amplified and synchronized. The crowd's energy fed individual excitement, creating feedback loops where individual and collective psychology reinforced each other. The shared gasps, cheers, and reactions created a sense of participating in something larger than individual experience. This crowd psychology had both positive and potentially troubling dimensions. The collective experience could create feelings of community, shared identity, and belonging that were deeply meaningful in positive ways. It could also create mob dynamics where individual moral judgment was overwhelmed by group excitement, leading to crowd reactions that individuals might later regret or question. The experience of witnessing suffering and death requires particular psychological consideration. Romans were more familiar with death and violence than most modern people. They lived in times when public executions were normal, medical intervention was limited, and mortality rates were higher across all ages. This familiarity didn't mean they were necessarily insensitive, but it did mean their baseline for processing such experiences differed from modern psychological frameworks. Some Romans clearly found aspects of the games disturbing. The philosopher Seneca wrote critically about the noontime executions, describing them as corrupting and disturbing spectacles that degraded both participants and viewers. The Christian writers who criticised the games focused partly on their cruelty and the moral damage attending them caused. These dissenting voices demonstrate that Roman reactions weren't monolithic. Even within Roman culture, people varied in their psychological responses and moral judgments. The concept of catharsis, emotional release through witnessing dramatic events, may have functioned for some Romans, allowing them to process emotions and tensions through the safe distance of spectatorship. Watching others face danger, demonstrate courage, or meet fate could provide opportunities to think about mortality, bravery, and life's precariousness without directly experiencing those dangers. For many Romans, probably the majority, attendance was simply a normal part of life, an expected activity that didn't require deep psychological justification or moral questioning. Just as modern people attend sports events, concerts, or movies without deep philosophical examination of what they're doing, Romans attended games as a standard form of entertainment and social participation. The anticipation before attending games created excitement that built over days or weeks. The actual experience delivered sensory and emotional intensity that justified the anticipation. The aftermath involved discussing what was witnessed, debating various moments, and processing the experience through conversation and reflection. This cycle of anticipation, experience and processing created ongoing psychological engagement that extended far beyond the hours physically present in the amphitheatre. The psychological impact probably varied significantly by individual temperament and personal experience. Some people thrived on the excitement and intensity, becoming passionate enthusiasts who attended regularly and developed deep engagement with gladiatorial culture. Others attended more reluctantly, fulfilling social expectations without particular enthusiasm. Still others may have actively disliked the games, but attended because social pressure or practical considerations made absence problematic. Children's psychological experiences require special consideration. Youngsters brought to games witnessed events that modern parents would shield children from, creating questions about how such exposure affected psychological development. Roman sources don't directly address this question in ways that satisfy modern curiosity, but the practice of bringing children suggests Romans believed exposure to the games was educational and character-forming rather than traumatic. The long-term psychological effects of regular game attendance aren't documented in sources that allow definitive conclusions. Whether repeated exposure to violence and suffering normalized such experiences in ways that affected Romans' psychology broadly, or whether the contextual framing that made games acceptable prevented spillover effects into other life domains, remains a matter for speculation and scholarly debate. What seems clear is that the psychological experience was complex, varied by individual and context, and was shaped by cultural frameworks that modern people don't fully share. Understanding this psychological dimension requires holding multiple ideas simultaneously, acknowledging that Romans experienced genuine enjoyment and meaning in games, while recognizing that aspects of that entertainment are troubling to modern sensibilities, without simply dismissing Romans as cruel or accepting everything they did as beyond moral judgment. The gladiatorial games weren't simply entertainment or cultural expressions. They were deeply embedded in Roman economic and political systems, serving functions that extended far beyond what happened in the arena. Understanding these dimensions reveals why the games persisted for so long and meant so much to Roman society. The economic costs of producing games were substantial. Major spectacles required significant financial investment. Purchasing or training gladiators, acquiring exotic animals, building and maintaining facilities, hiring support staff, providing food and entertainment, and covering countless other expenses. The inaugural games at the Colosseum in 80 CE, lasting 100 days and featuring thousands of animals and hundreds of gladiators, represented an enormous economic undertaking that demonstrated imperial wealth and generosity. These costs were borne primarily by wealthy patrons who sponsored games. Emperors were the most important sponsors, providing games that reinforced their popularity and demonstrated their care for the Roman people. The ability to provide spectacular games was a marker of successful imperial rule. Emperors who failed to provide adequate entertainment risked losing popular support. But beyond emperors, other wealthy individuals sponsored games as well. Magistrates seeking election or aristocrats maintaining status would sponsor gladiatorial shows, understanding that the political and social returns justified the financial costs. The expense could be ruinous. Some ambitious politicians bankrupted themselves sponsoring games, but the potential benefits made the gamble worthwhile for those seeking power or influence. The economics created a complex system. The games employed thousands of people: gladiatorial trainers, animal handlers, arena staff, vendors, musicians, construction workers maintaining facilities, and countless others whose livelihoods depended on the games continuing. The economic impact extended to suppliers, those who captured and transported animals, merchants who sold goods to spectators, craftspeople who produced equipment, and farmers who supplied food. The gladiators themselves occupied an interesting economic position. While most were slaves or social outcasts, successful gladiators could earn prize money, receive gifts from admirers, and even eventually purchase freedom. The economic rewards for successful gladiators could be substantial, creating perverse incentives where some free men voluntarily entered gladiatorial service, despite its dangers and social stigma. The trainers who ran gladiatorial schools, ludi, were businessmen investing in human capital. They purchased slaves or war captives, invested in training and equipment, and then hired out their gladiators to sponsors producing games. Successful trainers could become wealthy through this business model, though they also bore risks when their gladiators suffered injuries or were ended in combat. The political functions of games were equally complex and important. Games served as means of communication between rulers and ruled, providing opportunities for emperors to demonstrate qualities that legitimized their rule: generosity, power, connection to traditional Roman values, and care for public welfare. The games were political theatre where imperial virtues were performed and displayed. The crowd dynamics during games created opportunities for political expression from below as well. The assembled masses could voice opinions, make requests, and demonstrate approval or displeasure through their collective reactions. Emperors who ignored popular will did so at their own risk. Several emperors faced serious political consequences when they mishandled relationships with crowds at games. The famous story of gladiators and crowd decisions about their fate, whether defeated gladiators should live or die, decided by crowd sentiments signalled through thumb gestures, demonstrates this political dimension. The crowd's voice mattered, and emperors or sponsors who violated crowd preferences risked angering thousands of citizens whose collective opinion had political weight. The games also served as tools for managing social tensions and potential unrest. Providing free or low-cost entertainment kept the urban masses occupied and content, reducing the risk of riots or political opposition. The concept of bread and circuses, panem circenses, captured this political calculation: keep the people fed and entertained, and they would remain politically docile. This cynical interpretation, while partially true, oversimplifies complex realities. Romans weren't simply passive masses manipulated through entertainment. They were active participants who understood the political dynamics, who made judgments about emperors based partly on how well they provided games, and who used game attendance as opportunities for political expression and community building. The distribution of costs and benefits had political dimensions as well. Games were theoretically free for Roman citizens, subsidised by wealthy sponsors. This made games accessible to all social classes, creating cross-class experiences that reinforced Roman identity, and created the impression, if not, always the reality of social unity and shared culture. However, access wasn't entirely equal. The seating arrangements favoured the elite with better views and comfort. The ability to attend frequently depended on having time available, which meant workers with demanding schedules or seasonal agricultural labour might attend less frequently than others. The free entertainment still required economic capability to travel to Rome for those living in surrounding areas, and to take time away from labour that might otherwise generate income. The political messaging embedded in games content was also significant. When condemned criminals were executed, often as part of dramatic reenactments of mythological stories, these spectacles communicated clear messages about power, justice, and the consequences of violating Roman order. When exotic animals were displayed and dispatched, this demonstrated Roman power over nature and foreign territories. The gladiators themselves, often war captives or slaves from conquered territories, represented symbolically conquered enemies. Watching them fight and sometimes perish reinforced Roman superiority and justified imperial expansion. The games were thus not just entertainment, but also propaganda that reinforced political ideologies and imperial narratives. The political importance of games meant that their management was serious business. Officials oversaw game production, enforced regulations, managed crowd control, and ensured that events served their political purposes. Failure to manage games well could have political consequences. Riots, injuries, or perceived mismanagement reflected badly on responsible officials and could damage political careers. The economics and politics of games were thus inseparable from their entertainment functions. The massive investment in games made sense only because they served multiple purposes: entertainment, social cohesion, political legitimization, economic activity, and cultural expression. Understanding these dimensions helps explain why Romans invested so heavily in institutions that to modern eyes might seem like expensive, troubling spectacles without clear purpose beyond base entertainment. While modern people often think of gladiatorial games purely as entertainment or political spectacle, Romans understood them as having significant religious and ritual dimensions. The games were embedded in religious calendars, associated with religious festivals, and carried meanings related to Roman relationships with the divine. The origin of gladiatorial combat was funerary. The earliest Roman gladiatorial contests were held as part of aristocratic funeral rites, honouring the deceased through violent displays believed to honour and appease the dead. While this funerary connection became less prominent as games evolved into regular public spectacles, the religious associations never entirely disappeared. The gladiatorial oath, Sacramentum Gladiatorum, was a religious vow as well as a professional commitment. Gladiators swore to endure branding, chains, and even death, offering themselves in service with language that had sacred overtones. This oath was witnessed by the gods, making it a religious as well as social and legal commitment. The procession that began the afternoon gladiatorial program, the pompa, had ceremonial and quasi-religious dimensions. The formal entry, the display of equipment, and the ritual preparations before combat created sacred atmosphere that elevated the proceedings beyond mere entertainment. The participants weren't simply engaging in fights. They were performing a ritual that had meaning in Roman religious and cultural frameworks. Certain games were explicitly associated with religious festivals. The Ludi Romani, Ludi Plebei, and other annual festivals included gladiatorial displays as part of broader religious observances. These connections meant that attending games could be an act of religious as well as civic participation, honouring gods and participating in communal religious life. The Temple of Venus and Roma, adjacent to the Colosseum, physically linked the arena to religious space. The proximity wasn't accidental. It reinforced connections between entertainment, political power, and religious devotion that characterized Roman public life. The games occurred in a landscape saturated with religious meaning, situated among temples, shrines, and sacred spaces. Animal sacrifices were common in Roman religion, and the slaughter of animals in mourning Venetians echoed ritual sacrifice practices. While Venetio weren't identical to temple sacrifices, the overlap in imagery and meaning created associations. The exotic animals dispatched in the arena represented nature conquered and offered up, parallel in some ways to domesticated animals offered in temples. Victory and success in the arena could be attributed to divine favour. Gladiators who survived multiple combats might offer thanks to particular deities, dedicating portions of their winnings or commissioning votive offerings. The sense that the gods influenced outcomes created religious dimensions to what modern people might see as purely physical contests. The concept of Fortuna, the goddess of fate and luck, was particularly relevant to gladiatorial combat. Success or failure in the arena could be understood as manifestations of Fortune's favour or disfavour. Gladiators might pray to Fortuna before combat, and spectators might invoke her name when discussing outcomes. This religious framing helped Romans make sense of the randomness and unpredictability that characterised combat results. Some religious figures objected to the games, particularly as Christianity spread through the empire. Christian writers condemned the games as immoral, cruel, and incompatible with Christian values of mercy and compassion. The conflict between Christian opposition and traditional Roman religious acceptance of the games created tensions that contributed to eventual decline of gladiatorial spectacles in the later empire. However, before Christianity became dominant, traditional Roman religion didn't view the games as problematic. The displays of courage, honour, and proper behaviour in facing mortality aligned with Roman religious values about virtue and proper conduct. The connections to festivals, the ceremonial dimensions, and the overall embedding of games in Roman religious culture meant that attending games could feel like participating in sacred traditions as much as secular entertainment. The role of Vestal Virgins, sacred priestesses who maintained Rome's eternal flame, provides interesting insight into religious dimensions. These holy women sat in places of honour at the games, their presence lending religious sanction to the proceedings. Their opinions about gladiator fates were supposedly taken seriously, suggesting religious authority influencing even the entertainment aspects of the games. Omens and portents were sometimes discerned from game events. Unusual occurrences, unexpected animal behaviour, surprising combat outcomes, weather phenomena during games might be interpreted as signs from the gods, messages about the state of Rome or warnings about future events. This interpretive framework added layers of meaning beyond surface entertainment value. The combination of entertainment, politics, and religion that characterised Roman games created experiences that were holistically meaningful in ways that modern, compartmentalised thinking struggles to capture. Romans didn't necessarily separate entertainment from religion or politics in neat categories. All existed together, interpenetrating and mutually reinforcing, creating unified experiences that served multiple functions simultaneously. Understanding these religious and ritual dimensions helps explain why the games persisted despite their costs and occasional controversies. They weren't simply frivolous entertainment, but rather institutions embedded deeply in Roman religious life, cultural identity, and cosmic understanding. The religious meanings gave weight and significance to spectacles that might otherwise seem trivially entertainment-focused, connecting individual attendants to larger questions of divine favour, proper piety, and cosmic order. The gladiatorial games didn't end suddenly, but rather declined gradually over several centuries, driven by changing economic realities, shifting cultural values, and particularly the rise of Christianity. Understanding this decline reveals both how deeply embedded the games were in Roman culture, and how dramatically society could change given sufficient time and motivation. The costs of maintaining the games increased as the empire faced economic pressures. Capturing exotic animals became more difficult and expensive as nearby territories were exhausted, and more distant sourcing became necessary. Training gladiators required sustained investment that stressed imperial finances. Maintaining facilities like the Colosseum demanded ongoing resources. As imperial wealth declined in later centuries, the lavish games of earlier periods became increasingly difficult to sustain. The changing political landscape also affected the games. As imperial power became more bureaucratized and less dependent on direct popular appeal, emperors felt less pressure to provide elaborate games to maintain political support. The political calculation that made massive expenditure on games seemed worthwhile shifted as the relationship between rulers and ruled evolved. Christianity's spread represented perhaps the most significant force behind gladiatorial decline. Christian theology emphasized mercy, compassion, and the sanctity of human life in ways that conflicted fundamentally with gladiatorial combat. Christian writers condemned the games as immoral spectacles that degraded both participants and viewers, incompatible with Christian values. As Christianity gained influence and eventually became the official religion of the empire, Christian moral opposition translated into concrete restrictions on the games. Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, issued decrees limiting gladiatorial combat in the early 4th century. These restrictions weren't immediately or universally enforced, but they signalled official disapproval that had been absent when traditional Roman religion dominated. The games persisted for decades after initial Christian restrictions, demonstrating both their cultural entrenchment and the difficulty of eliminating institutions so deeply embedded in Roman life. Traditional Romans resisted change, arguing for preserving ancestral customs and traditional entertainment. The games continued in modified forms even as gladiatorial combat became less common. The traditional narrative holds that gladiatorial combat ended completely by the early 5th century, though the exact date and circumstances remain debated by historians. The famous story of the monk Telemachus jumping into the arena to stop a combat and being stoned by the crowd, leading Emperor Honorius to ban the games in 404 CE, appears in some sources, but is questioned by modern historians, who note that references to gladiatorial shows appear in sources after that date. What seems clear is that gladiatorial combat declined gradually through the 4th and 5th centuries, becoming less frequent, less elaborate, and less central to urban entertainment. Animal displays continued longer than gladiatorial combat, as these were considered less morally problematic. Eventually, however, the entire complex of games that had defined Roman entertainment for centuries faded away, as the Roman Empire itself transformed. The physical spaces survived longer than the practices they housed. The Colosseum continued to be used for various purposes after gladiatorial games ended: as a fortress, a quarry for building materials, a Christian shrine commemorating early martyrs believed to have perished there, and eventually as a tourist attraction and symbol of ancient Rome. The legacy of the games extends far beyond their actual historical period. The image of gladiators has captured imaginations across centuries, inspiring artistic representations, literary works, and eventually films and popular culture. The Colosseum has become one of the world's most recognisable landmarks, symbolising both Roman grandeur and ancient entertainment. Modern fascination with gladiators reflects complex attractions and repulsions. The martial skill, courage, and drama appeal to audiences across cultures. The exotic otherness of Roman entertainment creates distance that makes it easier to consume as entertainment than if it were contemporary practice. The moral questions the games raise about violence as entertainment, exploitation, and social values create ongoing discussions relevant to modern contexts. The archaeological and historical study of the games has revealed enormous amounts about Roman society, technology, architecture, social organisation, entertainment culture, and values. The Colosseum remains a crucial site for understanding Roman engineering and building techniques. The artefacts associated with gladiatorial culture, weapons, armour, inscriptions, artistic representations, provide insights into aspects of Roman life that literary sources alone couldn't illuminate. The ethical legacy is complex. The games serve as historical examples of how normalised violence can become when embedded in cultural and religious frameworks that justify it. They demonstrate how entertainment and spectacle can serve political purposes, while also genuinely appealing to audiences. They show how economic interests, social pressures, and cultural traditions can perpetuate institutions that outsiders or later generations find troubling. The modern debates about appropriate entertainment, violence in media, and the ethics of spectacle often reference Roman games as extreme examples of entertainment that crossed moral lines. These references sometimes oversimplify historical realities, but reflect genuine questions about where societies should draw boundaries around entertainment content. The games also represent a reminder of cultural relativism's limits and challenges. Understanding why Romans enjoyed and valued the games requires historical empathy and willingness to comprehend different cultural frameworks. However, this understanding doesn't require accepting that everything any culture does is equally valid or beyond moral judgment. Wrestling with this tension, understanding historically while maintaining ethical principles, remains an ongoing challenge in engaging with difficult aspects of past. And so, as we step back from the Colosseum's packed stands and the roar of ancient crowds fades into the silence of centuries, we're left with a complex picture of human experience that resists simple interpretation or easy judgment. The reality of watching gladiators was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than popular imagination suggests. For the tens of thousands of Romans who attended games regularly, the experience was normal, a standard part of life, an expected form of entertainment and social participation that didn't require special justification or moral questioning. They attended as modern people attend sports events, concerts, or movies, seeking entertainment, social connection, and participation in shared cultural experiences. Yet the content of what they watched was undeniably harsh by contemporary standards. The suffering of animals, the violence of combat, the executions staged as entertainment, all of this strikes modern sensibilities as cruel, exploitative, and morally problematic. This creates the central challenge in understanding gladiatorial spectatorship, acknowledging that Romans found genuine meaning and enjoyment in practices that contemporary ethics condemn. The physical experience was intense and often uncomfortable. Hours on hard stone seats, in heat or cold, surrounded by thousands of others, exposed to overwhelming sensory inputs. The social experience was stratified and carefully organised, reinforcing hierarchies while also creating collective identity. The emotional experience mixed genuine excitement, appreciation for skill, social engagement, and participation in culturally meaningful rituals. The economic and political dimensions reveal that the games served purposes beyond simple entertainment, functioning as tools of governance, displays of power, and mechanisms for managing social tensions. The religious and cultural meanings embedded in the games created significance that transcended their surface brutality, connecting attendants to Roman values of courage, honour, and proper conduct. Understanding all of this requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, recognizing Romans as full human beings with complex motivations, rich cultural lives, and genuine values, while also acknowledging that aspects of their culture are legitimately troubling from contemporary ethical standpoints. Neither dismissing Romans as simply cruel, nor accepting everything they did as beyond criticism creates space for nuanced historical understanding. The legacy of the games extends into contemporary times through the physical survival of the Colosseum, ongoing scholarly research, artistic and popular culture representations, and the moral questions that Roman practices raise. Modern fascination with gladiators reflects both attraction to martial skill and exotic historical practices, and discomfort with the violence and exploitation that characterise the games. Perhaps most importantly, engaging seriously with Roman games challenges contemporary people to think carefully about their own entertainment choices, the purposes entertainment serves, and the values that societies express through what they choose to watch and celebrate. While few modern entertainments approach gladiatorial games in their explicit violence, questions about appropriate entertainment, the ethics of spectacle, and the relationships between violence and amusement remain relevant. The Romans who climbed the Colosseum stairs found their seats among thousands of others and spent long days watching combat and spectacle were humans whose experiences, while distant in time and different in content, were fundamentally recognizable. They sought entertainment, connection, meaning, and participation in something larger than individual existence. They brought to their spectating the full range of human emotions: excitement, empathy, cruelty, generosity, judgment, and compassion. Their world is gone, the Colosseum now a partial ruin haunted by tourists rather than filled with cheering crowds. But the questions their entertainment raises remain live issues. What do society's entertainment choices reveal about values? How should violence be represented and consumed? What purposes does spectacle serve? How do collective experiences shape individual psychology? These questions persist, making the Roman games not just historical curiosity, but an ongoing prompt for reflection about human nature, social values, and the complex relationships between entertainment, ethics, and communal identity. The reality of watching gladiators in the Colosseum was thus neither simple spectacle nor straightforward cruelty, neither mere entertainment nor pure political manipulation. It was all of these things and more, woven together in ways that served multiple purposes and created experiences that tens of millions of Romans over several centuries found meaningful, exciting, and worth attending despite costs in time, comfort, and occasionally conscience. Understanding their experience in all its complexity and contradiction offers valuable perspective on both the alien qualities of distant cultures and the persistent threads of human experience that connect past to present across the vast gulf of time.